Hi, and welcome to the Ascension McKinney podcast. My name is Pastor Seth Williams. I'm a lead pastor and church planter for Church of the Ascension. We're a new church startup here in McKinney, Texas, and we're on mission to bring all people into the fullness of life through a relationship with Jesus Christ. Our podcast is all about the things that are going on in McKinney, Texas, and how Christians can be a blessing to the area around us, and also just talking about church and faith in general. Today's topic, I think, is one that's on a lot of our minds, and that is teen depression. Recently, we've been seeing a lot of news stories about how teen depression and suicidal ideation are on the rise, and a lot of parents are very worried. Am I doing enough? Am I being a good enough parent? So I decided to invite a friend of mine named Dr. Ken Wilgus onto the show, who's an adolescent psychologist and an Anglican deacon at our sending church down in Plano. I'm so thankful for his ministry and his career and his insight. So hopefully this is a help to you, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, Facebook and Instagram. We're also on Spotify as well. Well, thank you so much again for coming on our podcast and talking to us.
Sure. Glad to be here.
Could you start by just giving us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do?
So I'm Ken Wilgus. I'm a psychologist. Been in practice for almost 35 years. And I specialize with adolescents, families, and marriage. And I wrote a book called Feeding the Mouth That Bites You, which is about parenting teenagers. So that's why I get asked a lot about adolescents. I've worked with adolescents for a long time.
And so do you see a lot of teens throughout the week at your practice? Is that mostly who you're seeing?
Yeah, actually, recently I stopped seeing new teenagers. I'm getting old, Seth, so I'm working fewer days per week. So I do a lot of consulting with parents about teenagers now and send their teenagers to younger, hipper therapists. And I'm continuing to see the teenagers that I've had, and the rest of some of them now are older. They haven't seen me for years straight, but they on and off. So I'm continuing to see all those.
Well, that's great. So recently there was some research that was released, and this is kind of the topic of what we're talking about today. It talked about there's like a record high number of teenagers who are self-reporting that they feel depression and suicidal ideation. I'm assuming you've heard about that. Can you give us a little more background and information on what's going on in our country?
Yeah, it's particularly our girls, and what's sort of discouraging, but also I guess enlightening, is that our teenagers are more insightful. They know more words for their inner life than ever. We've taught them depression, impulsive, um, all these things that, in a way, are tools to be helpful to communicate. What's going on inside you. Certainly, what kind of struggles you're having, what pain, all that. However, you couple that with other things that were unexpected, like technologies and so forth, and certainly isolation. And now we have kind of the problem of this kind of results that it's a little hard to say. I don't think there's any question that depression levels are up, but it's also what's up is a lot of people asking a lot of teenagers, "Hey, how do you feel? What are you,
Mm.
going through?" So there's I think a kind of a treatment effect a little bit that when you're asked all the time about sort of subtleties in your inner life, it may almost increase a kind of focus on the negative that teenagers are having. So it's definitely up, but it's also a part of the result of us teaching teenagers to talk to us a whole lot about their inner life.
So with that, do you feel like maybe it's more that we're looking for it more, and it's always been there, or it's we're looking for it more, and we're also definitely probably seeing an increase in teenagers saying they're depressed?
Definitely both. And the reason I think that's important is that part of a good treatment for depression is to be focused on other people and other activities, basically to find ways to get away from overthinking about yourself. That's not the only thing to do, but it's a pretty common. That was actually, I think, Alfred Adler a long time ago that talked about the need to invest yourself in other things. And I find it harder and harder to get teenagers or I should say, more and more of the depressed teenagers that I know are also very isolated, not really pressed. They're not really busy in other things, or even the things that they're busy with are all about them, their own interest, their own sport, their own, and it ironically kind of, I think, draws you back into the flat negative feeling that you have that is depression.
Right. That kind of brings up the next question I want to ask, because I think a lot of parents are going to be wondering, okay, is my child okay? Is this something I should be worried about? What are sort of the things parents would begin to notice if their son or daughter is beginning to slip into depression? What kind of behaviors do you see teenagers begin to exhibit?
Yeah, that gets into the other sort of stress, which is parents are so concerned about whether they're doing it right, how well they're
Mm,
doing, all that sort of thing. So you get a lot of inquiries into how are how are you feeling, and first thing parents need to know is when you hear your teenager saying that he or she is depressed. That does not mean they are suicidal. It's an odd thing to say. Like, shouldn't we always be careful for that? No, not exactly. It's there's lots of unhappiness, depression, and sadness that never gets into depression. I just find the reason I have to say that is parents get so worried about that that that's the first thing that comes to their mind. So the way to really think about when should you be concerned about depression is the primary cutoff is when it's affecting what this teenager needs to be doing. Like if it's actually interfering with basic function, like you've got to be going to school, need to be involved in your activities, you need to be doing social stuff. When it starts to significantly cut into your regular schedule of things you're doing, then that's definitely a time to think about maybe having a therapist evaluate or some other eyes on this. But within that level, still doing what they need to do. Grades are, a bit down, but not terrible. All that stuff. There's kind of within that range a normal level of depression that, strangely enough, I advise parents to not over respond to. Don't freak out. Remember when you were in eighth grade or seventh grade. It's almost never a happy time for a lot of us. It's
right.
a self conscious, kind of morbid moment. So, it's when it really interferes with functioning that you really first want to think about what do we do about this?
Right. So there's sort of a acceptable level of sadness and angst and anxiety that is going to be normal that uh, teenagers probably should be feeling about some of their life.
Right.
But when it begins to interfere with they're not actually able to function and continue on doing their life, that's when it really becomes a problem. Do you feel like some of the thing about using more of this clinical language, um, using the word depression as opposed to sadness, should that be something we should be thinking about? That perhaps depression may be too strong of a word sometimes to describe what someone's going through. That there's an acceptable level of maybe just a sadness people feel, as opposed to
Yeah.
reaching a clinical level of depression.
Yeah, that's an important point because depression would not necessarily even be the worst word. It's the wrong word. So when
Mm,
a teenager has lost a family member, when something has, when there's death or, excuse me, or, loss in different ways, it is appropriate to be sad. It's creepy if a teenager lost a parent 6 months ago is not feeling any, but sadness is not depression. So depression, a lot of the teenagers that come to my office have been told we're worried that you're depressed. So I always ask them, do you think you're depressed? Very commonly the answer is no. um, so I'll ask, well, let me ask you this. Do you ever feel sort of tired anger, the kind of feeling like, if I had the energy, I would be really ticked, but never mind. And
mm,
they'll be, well, yeah. And I'll say, okay. And with that, do you ever feel sort of bored? I don't mean yawning, lie back down in bed bored, but I mean sort of, kind of rocking back and forth. Let's go do something. Do you ever feel that? And they're like, yeah. And I'll say, well, that's depression for teenagers is very often a kind of tired anger with
Mm,
agitation, where it's almost a lack of emotion. There may be tears, but they're sort of bitter tears. It's much more often a kind of a sour, flat. The main feeling is fatigue and irritability and really short tempered. So sadness is, and by the way, depression plus time just gets worse. But sadness is focused. There's tears because of grief. You're focused on this thing that you've lost, even if it's certainly the thing you're going through, your parents' marriage, having to move. These are things that are realistically things to grieve, and those are really to be encouraged and not to be over worried about why in the world are you feeling this way. It's really more because grief plus time definitely gets better. So those
right.
are significant differences. Depression is not sadness.
So this kind of goes into, we shouldn't be afraid of those sort of negative feelings, that this is part of growing up and growing, that your kids are going to have to experience some of these negative moments and some of these hard moments, especially if they lose a grandparent or even a pet. Um, it's actually a good thing, you would say, for them to be experiencing that and letting themselves feel those emotions.
Yeah, and it's actually a particular issue I think that Christian parents should be thinking about because of this intense, almost false goal that if I do this right as a parent, then I should produce happy children that have no major struggles in life, and they go through up to this whatever fictional happy and satisfied, basically, which means making a lot of money and healthy and maybe have a good relationship. um, that's not our faith. We believe very
Mm.
strongly in our life is meaningful, and it will include struggles and difficulties that are a necessary part of our own personal growth, but definitely an essential part of our faith, because nobody has that rocket ship ride straight up to happy life. And yet there's so many more parents that really fear that these unhappinesses my kid is going through means that I'm not doing it right.
I think it's such an important point, because I think so much of this discussion is the parents feeling a guilt, um,
Oh
that
yes.
they've done something wrong, and that's why their kids are experiencing these sorts of things. I know you've written a book on this, and this is something you talk about a lot. Um, for parents of teenagers, what would you say sort of their primary goal or focus should be? If it is not just to say, okay, my goal is to make sure my kid's always happy, they have all the stuff they want. Um, what is sort of the North Star for a parent guiding a child through adolescence?
So the most common, the people that I come to see or that come to see me are involved and interested parents, and the most common parenting mistake that I see is using childhood parenting techniques with teenagers. Um, the whole point that I needed to write a book about was to remind everybody that while there's lots of things to know about parenting children and teenager, the path through that you must stay on with a teenager is that starting at about 13, you must be releasing more and more, preparing this teenager to be an adult and on their own. So childhood comes to its natural end at about 13. That's always been known around the world and for all time until in the West about 100 years ago. The word teenager was invented in 1942. It was not used ever before that. So our idea of this surly, um, deceitful, disrespectful teenager is a brand new invention after the Industrial
Mm.
Revolution. So the the difference is that a 13, 14, 15-year old are not old children that I used to have to remind them two or three times to clean the room. Now I have to yell at them five or six times. Maybe it's a hearing problem. No, it's a fundamental difference in young adults are now, which is what teenagers are. Young adults are wanting to know the answer to when will I be completely handling these things myself and how will I know I got there. So the fundamental difference is for parents to not, it's not an overnight shift. It's certainly not a kind of now you just go do everything yourself, but an orderly transfer of control in different areas of this teenager's life, that more and more the message, this thing that you don't like what I tell you to do, you need to handle that yourself because you're getting older. That's just a message that is like oxygen to an adolescent, but we almost never give that to them. Parents that are listening didn't get that message from their parents, probably. It's an often missed kind of focus of, this is what we're doing now. And it's not the same as when you were 8. It is a completely different uh, approach that looks at a clock on the wall that says, there's only so much time left before you have to be doing this yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because we do tend to sort of romanticize this teenage period. There's so many movies and books that center around it, but really, it's okay. You were a kid, but now it's time to start being an adult in some ways. Obviously, you're not financially or even maturity level wise ready to handle the things that a 40-year-old could, but they need to begin to do some of that. Obviously, when you see a little child, they have they're feeling emotionally a certain way. They have a problem. We as parents want to rush in and begin to comfort them and try to take that pain away. But probably in the realm of this discussion, when it comes to letting young adults begin to sort of have some ownership over their own actions, it's letting them make mistakes and letting them experience that fall, and not always rushing in to try to make all that pain go away.
That's right.
Um, of
And
actually saying, hey, you,
some of that is parenting older children. You can read that in parenting books about, um, they need to experience their own failure and struggles to a limited, parents limit how bad that gets. But with teenagers, it actually is even different from that. It is not giving more and more privilege, and if they mess it up, you take it back. It is really recognizing the freedoms that you must give them. And freedom is different. It is something that, by watching how much time is left, we can no longer, well, for example, many things you have to really give over as a freedom because you are not controlling it. One of the easy ones is what music that you allow a teenager to listen to through their own headphones, as long as it's not bothering anybody else. Parents of teenagers need to know, just in case you don't know, your teenager will listen to whatever music they want to. You don't have that control, unless there's an Amish person, but they wouldn't be listening to your podcast. You just don't have control over that. So it is ineffective to continue to pat yourself on the back and let your teenager pretend with you that you're really keeping them safe from some of this really bad music, which, by the way, current music. I was talking to a group of parents on Friday, and this mother said, "Have you listened to the music that's out there today?" And I said, "Sadly, yes, I have, and I know it is horrible. It is obscene beyond belief. The question is, what's the most effective way to intervene with a young adult?" And repeating the rules that you told them year after year after year, pretending that you're going to, I'm going to get you in trouble if I ever find you listening to that, is weak. Reversing that by saying, I wish I could keep that from ever affecting you, but I know I can't. So you have to make that choice yourself. The appropriate side effect is that parents often don't even realize, is it opens up whole new levels of communication, that parents can, in
wow.
fact, now talk about this thing, like, hey, it's your choice, but this song that's on your playlist, tell me, does that not even bother you? Does that not get you about what it says about women? All kinds of level of real conversation that, we think it's normal for a teenager that to say, well, I don't, never mind, I don't want to talk to that whole defensive thing. That's part of a new creation of teenager that comes from still treating them like children.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Not to go too far from the topic at hand, but it kind of makes me think about when I'm counseling men who are dealing with a pornography issue of they're compulsively watching pornography, and in their recovery process, they might say, "Well, I messed up today because I saw this billboard and it had a Victoria's Secret ad on it, and I just, if only there weren't billboards like that." It's like, well, there are. You do live
That's
in a
right.
world where people use sex for advertising. You have to learn to be a Christian in that world and follow Christ in a world where that exists. The same thing goes for young adults. I mean, that music is out there. All their friends are listening to it. It's going to be something they have to deal with. Um, so as someone who's like watching that happen, this like a year ago, this person was a child, and now they're this new sort of creation, this monster that came into your house. Um, what do you think parents need to really be thinking about as they're dealing with, okay, they have to learn to be a Christian in this world, but I don't
Right.
want to see them get sucked into something that would really hurt them.
Well, again, I think that's the whole point, is that um, you don't have control over making sure they don't get, as you say, sucked into this world. You have to train them to have control. Pornography is a good example. You might sort of give the freedom to listen to whatever music you want to, but and I don't think any Christian family is going to give permission to watch whatever porn you want to. However, at the same time, you do have to acknowledge to a teenager, I know I can't make sure you don't look at that, so here's the things I'll have in place to try to keep you from looking at that. By the way, for teenagers, filtering the internet becomes much less effective, but monitoring is much more effective. Um, and even then, when pornography is discovered, which is quite common, so no need to freak out. It's just you need to be ready for it. Is uh, first intervention is probably not really so much punitive. It's not a punishment. It's a start. Hopefully, that you are talking to a Christian young person who is at least making efforts to remain kind of godly. In which case, then you're going to try to be alongside that teenager with that. That I'm still receiving the reports about where your phone internet is going, where your computer internet is going, and I know that there's other devices I probably am not seeing. Let's talk about how that's going. I think that's a huge thing where the church can and should get involved to it's really in that case not even a bad thing to help teenagers to recognize that the Christian life for adults is not some sort of pretend I'm doing really good. It is a constant repenting and turning over these things that I'm struggling with, and we use the community to help each other do that, to be to face the repentance and forgiveness that is a constant process.
Mm, that's really good. That kind of brings me to the last two questions are, okay, so we talk about teen depression, but I guess depression in general, you have someone in your life who's depressed. It could be your son or daughter. What are the best things you can do to help them get out of that depression and restore to a healthy life? And then on the other side of that, how does the church help with this? How does being in a church, what should a church be doing? How can the church be part of that, sort of helping that person find health mentally?
So if it's still at a level where it's not interfering with everything, but you hear this consistently from your teenager, they look flat and surly and all that kind of stuff, and so it's still the level of depression that hasn't, spilled over into some obviously um, disabling condition. Then in those cases, the first thing is you do not spend a lot of time speech making about, you need to what fill in the blank of whatever your favorite speech is, that kind of thing. Most teenage boys certainly don't want to be asked a whole lot. Are you depressed? You seem depressed. All that kind of stuff. Instead, the thing to do would be to really, again, number one, look at are your teenagers on any kind of path to freedom. The most common burden and tension in a home is a teenager that perceives that they're being controlled and treated like a child all the time. Not that they're always accurate about that, but you want to try to push back on that. That uh, because a major factor in general teenage happiness is their perception of purpose in life. Am I doing something? Having a kind of, I don't know, super parenting that is taking care of everything, and you're doing your cute little activities of whatever that is, your little sport, your little music, your little whatever, is it can be a really can really interfere with the important sense, the reality that young adults, teenagers, especially in Christian homes, they have an important purpose. So involving them in grown up stuff, mission trips, serving in the things that you're serving with, not because, again, not connected to a speech about how this is good for you, but genuinely, hey, I need your help with this. And you happen to be pretty good at this stuff. Can you come and help us work on the phones? We don't even know how to get our messaging together. Something that teenagers can feel their purpose and effectiveness, and especially in the kingdom, is pretty important. And that, I would say, is also where the church fits in. That as you know, I work a lot in trying to encourage churches to make realistic changes with their teenagers. We can't really do, I don't think, so much anymore, that old school youth group that you're off just doing singing camp songs and nobody really expects anything from you. You just go and hopefully you're entertained enough. It really has to be involved and connected with family and with purpose and the things that we're doing. Because then, lastly, I'd say the most important kind of differentiating point for depression is how socialized or how involved with people our teenagers are. That's a whole stump speech for me. Is just, even before COVID, I was very concerned about the increasing isolation on screens, not even just our teenagers and children, but as adults. We're so often withdrawn. We may even be in the room, but our presence is gone because we're looking at a screen and whatever. We don't get together with other people, anything like generations before. And that isolation is, no question, probably the top thing that is really pushing our adolescents. Not only are they alone, but they don't know what their purpose is, and they don't really have interaction meaningfully with lots of other people. If all the things that you can do as a family and with your church to push back against that is probably the strongest kind of resilience that you can build in your family system around your teenagers.
Yeah, the loneliness piece I think is so huge in this area. When we did our demographic research for our area, that was one of the top things people were reporting was loneliness. And I definitely think, I mean, the number one thing was people are still worried about the impact that the pandemic and the lockdowns are going to have on life going forward. People are still feeling that. But then almost right underneath that is loneliness, which when you are isolated in your home, a lot of those sort of social networks were broken down because of the lockdowns, that sort of thing. What we're seeing was there was already a loneliness problem, but now it's increased even more. And I think a lot of parents, they get worried that, okay, if a church does not have an exciting, or as you said, entertaining enough youth group, that their kids are going to get bored and leave. When the reality
Right.
is, like you were saying, the way to do it is to get them involved, give them some ownership and say, actually, this is my community too. And I'm actually an important functioning part of this. And then they can
That's
sort of
right.
see a future for themselves as sort of being on the same level as the adults, not just sort of underneath their parents or an extension of their parents.
And all of that in a general context of teenagers seeing a path that my parents are withdrawing their control in my life step by step. And in my parents' home,